What's up, y'all, and welcome back to Found Bytes, a game review series. My name is Brian, and I'll be your host. If you don't know about us, we're all about finding and testing out small, high-quality video games. This is a podcast that aims to respect your time and money as a gamer and a consumer by sifting through storefronts and sales to find those gems that may be worth your precious resources. But enough about the show. Let's get into our next game. Another Crab's Treasure is the game for this week's episode. Another Crab's Treasure is a 3D Souls-like action platformer RPG Metroidvania. It does it all. And it was developed and published by Aggro Crab Games and released in 2024. The game is available on PS5, PC, Switch, Xbox One, Series X and S. So interesting that it is on last gen for Xbox but not on PS4. And the game markets itself as Souls-like we said, as sort of an action-adventure, but it definitely dips heavily into being a platformer. It reminds me a lot of A Hat in Time, but also being a Souls-like, it has heavy RPG mechanics, and also a lot of Metroidvania aspects to it. But it's got large open maps, it's got challenging combat, tough bosses, and unique customization for this game because of the theme, which is kind of an under-the-sea type thing. It's like Dark Souls if it were in the world of Little Mermaid or SpongeBob even. Probably more so touches on comparisons to Sekiro, and it takes a little bit from Elden Ring, so it's definitely trying to be in that vein. But it's got all the hallmarks of being under the sea. There are crabs, you're using shells, it's got the whole aesthetic down of being underwater, but it's also got sort of a cutesy, tongue-in-cheek humor vibe, and reminds me a lot of like how Bug Fables would be. The game released with an MSRP of $29.99 and runtime, so on howlongtobeat.com it says beginning to end, just doing the story stuff, about 15 hours. It's saying 20 to 25 to 100% it. I don't really understand that. I feel like it's a bit more. I mean, on my PlayStation, I left it on a couple times, so it's at like 47 hours. But I would say I put at least 30 plus hours into it. And I've been playing it on PS5, and I got it on sale for $14.99, so half off. But I was super thorough, and I did get the Platinum Trophy. I would say it took me about 30 to 35 hours. I don't think the Platinum was that difficult, and it's interesting for me, though, because there were actually multiple times where I was ready to put it down for a couple reasons. But I stuck through it, and I was glad I did. The game had physical releases through iam8bit, and it was just a standard in-the-box edition, and it did it for PS5 and Switch, and that was available for $35. I think there may have been some inserts or instruction booklet or cards or something like that. And they also did a physical release of the vinyl, and that is on iam8bit for $43. I actually did just purchase that. I'm very excited about that. And like we said, the game was developed by Aggro Crab Games. This is a small team out of Seattle. They had made a game previously because as the credits were rolling, it said this is the second game from Aggro Crab Games. I'm not sure if I really know that game that they did before, but more recently they also made a game called Peak, which a lot of people are talking about as like a co-op sort of survival, I think. But it's definitely multiplayer. It seems to be all the rage. It looks super simple, but could be kind of fun. But I had not heard of this game. I saw it on sale. Instantly, the concept of just, having the Little Mermaid or SpongeBob or being under the sea aesthetic was really attractive to me, especially because it was marketed as a Souls-like. Obviously, I'm a really big From Software fan. I actually just jumped back into Elden Ring because my friend Paul is playing it. But really interesting, the juxtaposition of those two things in this fun, cartoonish setting. So I decided to jump in. All right, let's talk gameplay for Another Crab's Treasure. So there's a lot to cover here because this game tries to do a lot, and a lot of which I think it is successful. But it is this Souls-like, so it's third-person action-adventure. Let's go through some of the basics. So being third-person, you're moving around and you're moving the camera at the same time. You can invert both axes on the camera. Thank you to Aggro Crab Games for including that. You're moving fairly fast. There's a button to dodge roll, and if you hold it, you'll be running. So very similar to Bloodborne and Elden Ring and things like that. What is interesting and will be a future topic we're going to talk about as a source of frustration, but there's some inconsistencies or at least some frustration with the overlap of previous actions. So a lot of times, like if you jump and then you run before you jump, and then you get ready to land and are going to hold the run button when you land. If you hold it before you land, sometimes it doesn't register. So it's like there's this overlap where like you think you're running, but you're actually not, even though you're holding the button. So the game is really finicky, and I wouldn't say inconsistent because I think it's consistently annoying when it comes to that. But it's just like something that I really notice where like I'm pressing a button or I'm holding a button and the effects of it are not going, and I don't know the right tell for when to start it again, and I feel like I have to be overly intentional. So that really messes with sort of the sequence of what you're trying to do sometimes. But you are able to jump, and if you hold the jump button, you'll actually swim or kind of hover forward. So this will allow you to bridge like small gaps, or you can actually pulse it and it'll pace because there's a meter that pops up, and when the meter's out, then you can't hold it anymore, and then you'll just fall straight down. But this is going to be big when it comes to platforming. But again, some frustration here. Sometimes the environment can kind of trigger the jump even though you don't jump. So when you go to jump and get ready to hold, it's like already holding as if you're swimming, and all of a sudden you've lost some of your height and some of your ability to do some platforming. This is really annoying, and it reminded me a lot of my experience with Imp of the Sun, where it's like in that game you would hit the button and it thinks that you hit it twice, so then you don't get a double jump. So it's something interesting here, but it'll start you doing the hovering when like I didn't even get my max height out of my jump. It gets a little janky. It feels like it's double clutching without you knowing. I think it has to do more with the environment and some of the inconsistencies with like, is this a platform? Is it not? Because I found like there were even times as I was platforming where like I got stuck maybe between two rocks that I don't know were meant to be jumped on. And I was actually in some scenarios where like it thought that I was still falling. So like I couldn't jump out of it, and then I had to like try to move around, and it was this weird animation. You're able to block, and you do this by holding L1 on PlayStation, and instead of blocking, you're actually hiding in your shell, and you can actually hold it while enemies are attacking and things like that so that you're blocking, but you can move around while you're in your shell. You just move a little bit slower. You will get a melee weapon, and there's a button to swing it. It's kind of like a basic swing, but there will be like a combo sequence where it's like 1, 2, 3, and then maybe like a big one. You are also able to hold the melee swing button to get like a strong attack. There's a really big gap here in time, so you may want to time it like if enemies are farther away, like as they're getting closer to you but not quite in range. Like if you hold it, you're able to trial and error like the best time to do that. I would say, just on the top, eventually we'll talk more in detail about combat. I went into this maybe with the Bloodborne mentality of trying to do like quick sequencing and timing, and it is not that. It is not that at all. Like I said, there's already sort of a discrepancy with like when you should start the next action. Will it actually register? Do you have to wait until the last thing to play out and like let the controller clear all the button inputs? I don't know, but it is not Bloodborne, and that definitely tripped me up a bunch of times. All right, let's talk about the pacing of the game. So I would say that the game introduces most of the primary systems or functions in the first few hours, which is good because it allows it to build on those things, and anything you see there and after kind of makes sense given the context of what you already know. One of which is the shell system. And for this, I would say think pretty closely to Breath of the Wild. It's not with weapons like Breath of the Wild is, but it is where you're constantly going to find these shells and use them, and then they have a durability, and then when they're out, or even when you find something better, you're going to constantly be swapping in and out and leaving them behind. What's nice is you will find shells everywhere, just in the environment. They always have sort of like a sheen over them, and they're flashing like every few seconds, so you can spot them from afar. There are going to be different pieces of trash, which we'll talk about eventually. but you'll see like some consistency. It's not like a very wide eccentric range of them. There's about 70 different shells in the game, but it's like when you find one of them, it's like that's like you'll find like the soda can, and all soda cans have the same stats. One of them is like a tennis ball. All tennis balls are the same. And it's pretty easy to swap in and out pretty often, and it's pretty quick. You can even do this during combat as you're moving around and the prompt pops up. It'll happen pretty quickly, so you don't have to worry about having a long animation. These shells will have varying stats, so various defense, which is like how much damage they block. Durability, which is like how long until like that goes down and then it breaks and then it's gone. And then they'll all have special powers. Some of them will have recurring ones, but this is pretty cool and we'll talk about it eventually. They're also going to be different sizes, and this will pop up when you see the notification. When you're close to one, it'll say like its durability, its defense, its power, and then its size. It's going to be small, medium, or large. I don't know exactly the effect that has. I think that it slows the roll that you do, the dodge roll. I don't think it has an effect too much on your running speed, but it definitely feels cumbersome if you're in combat and you're working with like a large shell. Like you can definitely feel it kind of lagging. The special moves that the different shells will have are pretty cool. Some of them are going to be attack moves. Some of them are going to be like a passive defense move where enemies will get hurt if they attack you if you have this thing active. There'll be buffs, debuffs, pretty wide range, and you're going to consistently be finding better shells, and you're going to want to swap in and out. But what's nice is, like I said, there's 70 of them in the game or so. You will have like a shell recovery system eventually where like if you like a certain shell, whenever you like rest at a bonfire, you'll like get that shell back. So that's really nice. And let's talk about traversal mechanics. So we've already briefly touched on how it has Metroidvania aspects. I mean, these days, all games have Metroidvania aspects, but definitely some moves here that have to do with accessibility to certain areas. You'll be backtracking once you get these abilities, so on and so forth. One you'll get pretty early on is a hook shot, where anytime you see like a hook or something higher up, a little like aim meter will pop up, and as long as it turns yellow, you can use it and you'll hook up to there, and then you'll shoot up and you'll actually get shot up further in the air so that you can do your hovering and get to where you need to go. There will be others that you'll find. There are two major other ones, but you're finding them much later in the game. Once you find them, that's going to open up some serious backtracking where you're going to go back to old areas and be like, oh yeah, that block or that thing that I saw. You will get a skill tree pretty early on. And one of the first things that you'll get, I think it actually is the first thing that you're supposed to get, is the fast travel system. So unlocking that allows you to fast travel between bonfires. But then throughout the game, you can really add some cool abilities through your skill tree. The combat encounters in this game, so think Breath of the Wild, think Elden Ring. Enemies are everywhere, and you'll see them from afar. Sometimes you'll go to something, like even to pick up an item, and it'll be like kind of a trap. Like enemies will come up from the sand. So you'll see this a lot. Again, comes right out of these Souls-like quasi-open world games. Often it's going to be multiple. It's not too often where you're able to do one at a time. Even if you're able to attack one enemy at a time, it might like pull you away a little bit, and all of a sudden another will aggro in, and then another. So a lot of times you're going to be fighting packs of enemies. It's interesting because the way I feel that the game is paced, early on the game kind of makes you scared to engage. And I think it's interesting because it actually fits with the narrative. You are, which we'll talk about, this little hermit crab whose shell got taken away. So it does make sense narratively that you're like kind of a little scared or wimpy or whatever, but it takes time to understand the pace of combat. It's really going to be sword and board, using your shell or hiding in your shell. This can be tough, and one of the things that I think makes it a bit scary or intimidating is that when you have multiple enemies, they're kind of attacking you at different times. So like even when you go to try and swipe and get out of your shell and do an attack, like you might be leaving yourself open. So it can be tricky, especially because the enemy melee range and the speed can honestly make it pretty tough for you to escape encounters. It took a while for me to be able to just run away from things or figure out the best way to escape. Often you're just going to need to run in the other direction, but some enemies are tough, and especially if you're in a cramped space in the environment, some of these enemy attacks might actually be able to, poke you from pretty far. And we're saying Souls-like, so from the combat standpoint, very Souls-like. So you'll have an R3 target where you can lock onto different enemies. You can cycle through them, going back and forth. Some enemies will be doing specific attacks. There will be symbols that pop up if like you can or can't block it, but it's like a major attack. Reminds me a lot of Sekiro. You're going to have these heart kelps that are like your Estus flask, and you'll be using them in combat. The different enemies that you come across, they're going to vary in size. They'll vary in speed, they'll vary in their move sequence. Sometimes you're going to get enemies that kind of stun lock you, like they'll do one attack and it's like chomping down in front of them, and then they'll do 3 in succession. So this can be tough, especially if your back's against a wall trying to get out of areas. And you're going to have some areas that have these heavy snipers. When I first got to this one area that had these heavy snipers, it really just knocked me on my ass. And sometimes they're like automatic turrets. Sometimes they're really far away, and just getting to them is pretty tough. So you have to use the environment to hide behind things. Also, as you're battling enemies, they're going to have a stance bar. So this is right out of Sekiro. Like you'll see their health bar in red go down, but you'll see their stance bar from the middle get bigger and bigger outward, and if you hit it all the way, it'll like light up their whole health bar, and if you hit with a strong attack, you'll knock them over, and then you can do a lot of damage. Where the frustration comes in for me, especially with the combat, is that platforming is always in play. And there's always this sense of verticality that can be a little frustrating, because if you're trying to do combat, especially with a swarm of enemies or even just multiple, and you get somewhere where like your back is against the wall, or you're getting stuck on the environment or in between certain things, like you're going to have to like jump and hover to get out of certain situations, and trying to manage that at the same time as multiple enemies attacking, getting in your shell and blocking, it really just doesn't blend well, especially as you're locking onto enemies, because you're trying to move to the side and you might not even see that you're like walking right into a wall and you're putting your back against the wall, bringing back some of the earlier frustrations with like the varied timing of actions, like not being able to overlap actions or like quickly do things in succession. Like the game has a lag to the action input, and that coupled with you accidentally getting your back against the wall and having to jump and hover at the same time, but like when you're jumping and hovering and locking on, the direction that you're going gets a little inconsistent, and it just gets very frustrating. I found that I was very annoyed and like potentially throwing the controller in certain simple encounters where like I didn't know where I was in the environment, and now I'm trying to like hop up on platforms while not getting shot by a sniper. It just gets to be very much of a traffic jam and a source of frustration. And this is where I made the comparison where this is not Bloodborne or Sekiro. And you can't just quickly swing and block and dodge back and forth, because you're going to get slammed, and you might do 3 inputs and only one of them goes in, and then you're trying to block by the time the enemy is coming down with their sword or their claw or whatever. And it's just like you might be hitting the input before the attack lands, but if your animation or something is not finished of your attack, you won't get the block off. And then all of a sudden, like mid-swing or before you go to defend or block, like you're getting slammed and then knocked back. It just made my blood boil at times. And then even if you're trying to run away and like you just defended or you just attacked, and then you're holding circle to try and run away, and then it doesn't register that you're trying to run, just like made me want to punch a wall a couple times. Also, the healing mechanic is interesting. It's the equivalent of drinking an Estus flask, but if you get hit before you use the heart kelp, you actually drop it, and then it sits there in the environment. Then you have to go pick it up, and then you have to make sure that like you're around it, and the prompt comes up so that you hit it, and then you pick it up, but then you have to use it again. So it's like they take it out and then they go to eat it. But a bunch of times, like I'm trying to swipe and then block and then heal because I got hit. And then if I get hit while I heal, all of a sudden I just lost that heart, and now it's sitting there and I have to go get it back. So I don't want to harp on this too much, but it was the reason that multiple times I thought about putting this game down. Later in the game, I do feel like you get more confidence. I still think later fights in the game, I got caught up or I got pissed off in a boss fight or something like that, or just enemies in general interrupting you. It takes some time to know the pace of how things go. And if you go in like panic rolling or getting too many hits in or getting greedy with your hits, like that's where you're going to get slammed. So it's just a lot more of that sword and board simple pace. And I think that if you get confident in that and your ability to even just take a hit, you do feel more comfortable. And of course, coming along with that, there is leveling up. So like you are bolstering your stats a bit. Hits will do less damage to you, or you'll do more damage with your attacks, as well as when you're going back and revisiting old areas. Obviously, what was once scary is not as scary as much, so you get more daring. Sometimes if there are hordes, you'll wind up not locking onto them, and your attack swipes can actually hit multiple. Your strong attacks can actually interrupt enemies. So again, you just getting used to the timing of certain enemies, the encounters, and how they're going to play out, and being aware of your environment. Eventually you will get more confidence in it, but a lot of these little meticulous things that add up and really poke at you can still be present later in the game. So let's talk progression. So this game has some sequences that are linear, and then eventually they'll be open, and then when you go to certain areas in the open world, they'll sort of have linear areas at times. Moving forward in the game, I feel, is linear in general. It's interesting though, because there aren't really any markers, there's no arrows telling you where to go, there's no even quest log, and that can be annoying or overwhelming for some people. But I found, despite the fact that like you have these linear sequences, especially in the beginning of the game where it's just like go forward in the map, even when you get to places that are sort of like a giant circle or like open map, you can discern like, oh, this is going to be like a path to a dead end that has maybe some secrets or collectibles. And so you're able to navigate these areas, I feel, with a lot of certainty that like you're generally going the right way. Certainly the placement of bonfires helps. Like when you get to a new area, you'll have a bonfire pretty much near the beginning, and then you'll unlock shortcuts as you go, and maybe a bonfire in the middle, and then after the big boss fight or something like that. Bonfires are going to have your typical Souls-like purpose. You're going to respawn there if you die. That's where you fast travel to and from. When you go in, you rest. It resets your HP and the enemies, but also your Estus flasks or your heart kelps. One thing I will say in general about just trying to progress and navigating through the game, the map is not great. I think visually it gives you vague help or sense of like the platforms and where they are, or like the boundaries of the map and things like that, but you can't add any markers. There are multiple maps, one for each area, but when you're in one area, you cannot access the map of any other area. And also, you might be on a map that has like what looks like multiple exits or paths to other areas. Doesn't label anything about where they go to, how to get to certain areas. So I can definitely see if someone is lost in an area, not knowing where to go, or not knowing who to talk to, or how to figure out where to go. I can see that frustration coming up. I get a little frustrated looking at the map just in general because it only gives you the bonfires. Those are the only things that actually populate on the map, but they're not labeled or named. And so when you go to fast travel, it gets a little frustrating because like it'll have a list of all the bonfires in the different areas, but it won't show you like where on the map they are. It'll have it by name, and then it'll have a picture of like what it looks like there, but you can't coincide it with a location on the map. So if you're using the map visually to be like, oh, I want to remember this area because there's something here when I get this, traversal mechanic later, I want to come back here. There's no way that you're going to be able to pinpoint like which bonfire is in which location on the map because it doesn't show the name and the map at the same time. I think NPCs can serve as help for context in the story, but they don't really mark anything on the map, like I said, and it's not even really apparent who to talk to. Sometimes you will eventually get to a point where there's like a main town, and that's where you're revisiting, and when you get a quest item, you go back to there, so there is a person there that you're talking to, but before you get to that town, and even after that town, like you're not really getting NPC context. Again, I didn't find too much issue with like figuring out where to go, especially because you get to a point in the story where like you need to find 3 things and you can go in 3 directions or whatever. You have a vague sense of where to get them from. But a lot of times you're just kind of discovering things through open exploration when you get to new areas. and sometimes you'll have multiple areas sort of open at the same time. And I found that this aspect of open exploration is actually present pretty early in the game, but I think the game does a good job of pacing you by that sort of combat fear. Like, you do get to the main sort of central Hyrule field location, but it's gated because if you go outside the path, like, there's a really tough boss that is like wandering and will always find you. So the game is actually gating you by fear, which is nice. But eventually you'll, like I said, get that confidence to take things on, explore more. And I do feel like it's really fun eventually to explore different nooks and crannies, find collectibles. This is how you're going to find upgrades. You know, you'll run into roaming bosses that are optional. This is ultimately where I feel like the game shines, but it takes a little time to get there and to get confident to go out maybe not along the beaten path. I found that like after halfway through the game, I was enjoying it more because all of a sudden I got these new traversal mechanics and I felt comfortable exploring, and all of a sudden like you've got different tangents to go off of or different corners where like, oh, I didn't know something was here. And a lot of times that's where you're going to experience more of the traversal platforming aspect of the game. Again, reminds me a lot of Hat in Time crossed with Sekiro, because a lot of these offshoot corners are actually going to be like these vertical platforming challenges or just ways to keep going down a path, and eventually you'll discover something there. So a lot of times this is where you're going to be using your jump and your swim through the gaps, your hook shot, things like that. You're also going to be using the environment in a lot of these areas. So there's going to be trampolines that are these sponges, and they'll shoot you up pretty high. You're going to do a lot of climbing here, and you'll be able to do this anywhere you have sort of fish netting. You'll be using that hook shot. You'll find like bubbles will be sitting just between platforms, and when you jump or swim over to them or hover over to them and land on them, they'll like pop you up. So you'll get like a reset in your hover. And then, of course, you're going to be finding a lot of shortcuts. Definitely the Souls-like aspect of it. But the shortcuts are like these fishing rods that you just let it go down. And then all of a sudden you'll have access to hook shotting back up to a higher platform. Some minor frustration, of course, here. We talked about the environment and sort of like questionable platforms or edges. Like, there's definitely some scenarios where the environment is going to be a little janky, or you're going to be unsure if like you can jump on this to get higher up. You're going to have situations where the boundaries or the possibilities are a little fuzzy and not clear. So you might see like a place up high and it's like, I have to be able to get there. There's a thing there or something like an item. And then you're going to walk around and like testing these edges of rocks and things like that. And then you'll get on them and then you'll slide down. But then sometimes you'll be able to jump on them. So a little inconsistency here that can be a source of frustration with the platforming. Bosses are going to be a lot of what gatekeeps different areas or progression from one area to another, but also like they'll be holding quest items, so you'll be having to fight bosses a lot. These are generally just going to be big, tough enemies. Sometimes they'll have minions, sometimes they will have platforming involved in the boss fight or other kinds of gimmicks. Again, having to do that platforming or jumping and hovering while also locking on, while also trying to make sure the timing of your attacks or your blocking or your healing aren't getting interrupted or confused by the game. And of course, the open exploration and the traversal platforming is going to lead to a lot of collecting. So you're going to find a lot of things out there. You're also going to be able to buy some collectibles. But this is going to be based in the different currencies that you're going to use. So you've got microplastics, which is the main currency, and crystals. And the crystals are primarily going to be used for purchasing different upgrades for your character. So you're going to find a lot of these by killing enemies, killing bosses. You'll get a lot of microplastics from selling junk that you find. And the crystals you'll find a lot in the environment in sort of like these crystals that are just sitting and you have to break them. Something you'll find is a pretty cool mechanic, which are stowaways. And these are like items that you will equip that'll give you buffs, but you'll have certain maxes. Like you can only equip 3 stowaways at a time, but each stowaway is going to have different star values. And you're going to have a max star value that you can have that's always going to be more than 3. So it starts at 3, which means if you want to equip 3 stowaways, each can only have 1 star, but you can upgrade the max stars. This was a little confusing in the beginning for me because I wanted to upgrade the number of stowaway spots that I could have, but that's always going to be 3. So basically you can only equip 3 of these sort of stowaways, which function like talismans in Elden Ring, but you can get better versions of them that are worth more stars. So I think I ended the game with 10 stars or 9 stars or something like that. So I could have like one stowaway that has 5 stars, one that has 2, another that has 2. So any kind of combination. These are things that you're going to find in the world or by killing either bosses or bigger enemies. And what's nice is you can easily go into the menu at any time and swap them in and out. So it's not something you have to only do at a bonfire. But these are going to be buffing your stats. It might add to some of your stats. It might give passive effects. It may recharge your health. It may help recharge your skill charges, which we'll talk about. But you're going to find these a lot, and you can buy and sell them when you find better versions. And you're going to get multiple of the same, so you can sell them and actually get a lot of currency so you can buy better ones. You're going to find upgrades out in the world, and some are just going to be straight upgrades. Like you'll find upgrades to your number of health items or your Estus flasks, and you'll just find this and automatically you'll get 1 added to your total. You're going to find upgrades to your max health and your umami charges, which are the charges that you use for the moves of your shells and your skills. But for both of these, you're going to find pieces. I think you need to find 3 of the whorls or whatever to get a new charge for your skills, but you need 5 of the health upgrades to get more health. You're going to level up a lot, and you're going to use the microplastics currency, so there is a little bit of like prioritization with what you want to use the currency for. But your character's going to have 4 stats: vitality, resistance, attack, and the last one's called MSG. I forget what it actually means, but that's for like the power of your skills and shell powers and things like that. But you can upgrade all of these. Vitality is your max health. Resistance is like how much damage your shell can block. Attack is your physical attack. You're also going to have special moves like we've vaguely been talking about, and these are going to be ones that you will actually find out in the world. A lot of them you're going to get from killing specific bosses. Sometimes you might get them from NPCs if you're doing like mini side quests. But there are 8 in total in the game, and you can always have 2 equipped, and you can swap between them in combat and whatever. But again, just like the stowaways, you can actually go into the menu and swap them in and out pretty quickly, even during combat. When you use these are going to use charges. Some moves are going to use more charges than others, but this sort of charge mechanic and recharging them, you're actually going to recharge just by attacking enemies. So if you're really engaged in combat, like you really want to do all of these things, like use your powers, use your shell skills or whatever, but also like you're going to need to get in and attack your enemy to recharge that during a big battle. And of course, collecting shells, we've talked about, like you can easily find shells in the world, swap in and out when one's about to die. But what's nice is you can actually purchase shell insurance for any of the shells that you've ever had on before. This is nice because there's a shop in the main town where you pay. There's going to be different costs for the different shells. You pay once, and then automatically you get to go into your shell menu when you go to any bonfire, and you choose which one is going to be insured that time. And anytime you go into your bonfire without a shell on, it'll automatically regen that shell on you. So this is a nice way to just maintain which shell you like. Or depending on the situation, certain shells have specific powers that are helpful against certain bosses, maybe, things like that. And then finally, in terms of accessibility, the difficulty in this game is fully customizable. So from the damage that you receive to the resistance to your attack, it does have pre-rendered difficulty modes. You've got easy mode, story mode, hard mode. The hard mode is actually the default mode, and that's where it's really trying to push like being a Souls-like, I guess, because the game can be relentless at times. You can jump in and really customize a lot of different aspects of the game to fit your difficulty liking. But in general, I feel like the game's hard, and I'm not sure if it's really just because of the frustrations that I talked about in the inputs or things like that. But eventually you get to a point where honestly, there's no max level, so you can keep leveling up if you keep finding currency, especially after you've already collected all the things, so you don't need the currency for anything else. Honestly, by the time I got to the final boss, I felt unbeatable. And the final boss is like a sequence of a couple bosses. I like barely had to use a health item, like I was just so overpowered. So there is a way to get yourself up to feeling confident and really unstoppable in this game, which is fine. I like that, especially given the contrast in the beginning of the game where you really felt small and kind of, things were out of your reach. All right, let's talk about the vibe of Another Crab's Treasure. And it really starts with the setting and the theme. So the main draw of this game for me, and I think for a lot of people, will be this under the sea scenario where it's like Little Mermaid meets SpongeBob. But of course it's in 3D. Just having a lot of these sea creatures. Everything is sea creatures. The enemies, the NPCs, the bosses, either crabs or urchins or fish or seahorses or whatever. And it starts with you. You are a hermit crab. And this makes the shell mechanic super interesting and just so relevant. It's nice when gameplay really ties with the theme of the game. So I like this idea of like you're constantly just finding better shells and you're just abandoning the previous one, much like a hermit crab would do. It's just something like that that's very tightly knit and makes a lot of sense and adds to the charm. You're going to be on the ocean floor. It's mostly sand with some coral at times. Other times you're going to have a lot of human objects, some very large. Like I think for some of the castles, like they make sand castles, but then like the gates are like these giant combs that can lift up. There's going to be a lot of human trash around. Sometimes it's just like water bottles floating that you can't really use, but other times like the things you're using for platforms are objects that make a lot of sense. You'll find like soda cans, boxes. It's funny to see some of the objects with like brand names on it because they change them around to be like puns that have to do with underwater. So a lot of times you're just walking through the environment and you're definitely going to chuckle a bit. Just little touches like that I think go a long way. Like when you're talking with NPCs, there's a lot of cursing in the game. Like they do say like shit and whatnot, but like instead of bullshit, they'll say gull shit. Or like instead of goddamn, they'll say cod damn, and it's like, you know, it's kind of funny. It gets a little old at times, but other things that are interesting, like I said, there's a lot of it being a Souls-like and the inspiration being there, but then there's some literal inspiration, like when you go to the main sort of like I said Hyrule field, like open area that connects all of the areas. It's called the Sands Between, much like the Lands Between in Elden Ring. So little things like that, I think this game showing its heart on its sleeve, it's really interesting and charming. The story and the characters, this is where it gets a little cheesy and a little cringy, I feel. The story in general is pretty typical for a game like this, like, you know, one small person, small beginnings, becoming the big hero. It doesn't ultimately work out like your typical Zelda, but it is that sort of story track. There's a lot of heavy environmentalism here. So just the idea of human trash, pollution, you know, oil coming in or corruption, but also like corruption of people and business. So it's interesting because it's kind of a macro and a microcosm because there's like characters in the game that are treating other characters in like an oppressive sort of capitalistic way, but then the whole idea that like there is trash here is clearly from humans, like sort of like an inside-outside commentary. But there's also the aspect of how like a lot of the characters like the trash being there, like it's a source of wealth, but it's also like not good for them, like the consequences of it, it's like bad. Like the idea that your currency is microplastics is trying to touch on a lot of things that we're experiencing in society or like realizing about things. It's interesting that they call it trash when like they're treating it as treasure, which is maybe kind of a play on the name of the game. But it's interesting having that negative connotation, but like everybody loves it, and like having it is like you can buy and sell it, and it's weirdly kind of dancing on each side of the fourth wall a bit, I feel. The idea of the bosses kind of being polluted or corrupted, I don't know exactly what that's getting at. If it's trying to be like Haiku the Robot, where like there's this scourge that's like infecting people or whatever and turning them. There's also a lot of talk in general about mental health, especially with your character, feelings of loneliness, selfishness, like how do we deal with scenarios where someone's being very selfish and sort of like dark thoughts as individuals. I would say the dialogue, the advice that's given, the lessons that are really spelled out really become heavy-handed, sort of after-school special. And it kind of is a weird juxtaposition because you've got like clear cursing in the game, but then like these clear lessons that I feel like are more for kids. And I wonder sometimes like who is this game really for? Who is it talking to? I think it's obvious that like what it's dealing with, you know, in the parallels to society now and things like that. But it's just interesting because I don't really know what more it's trying to say. I just feel in general, I didn't get too invested in the characters and the dialogue. I feel like a lot of the dialogue was long and it was just like over and over and over. And I found myself actually skipping through. I also didn't feel like the named NPCs were that obvious, at least in the first third of the game. And then it was like, oh, I guess there are these recurring characters, but I just didn't find them that interesting. Maybe a little too heavy-handed with the lessons and the preaching. I just kind of rolled my eyes at times. Maybe about halfway through, you start to realize there's some recurring characters. The audio in this game also has this sort of cringiness to it. I feel like the voice acting is really cringe. It's very young cartoons, kind of overacted. Maybe I feel this is what kept me from connecting with characters a lot. Even my character, I was just like, this guy is super whiny. I do feel like the sound effects were very good and satisfying, especially in combat when you use a move or a power, when you're low on HP, when you get hit, when you hit the enemies. Like, you're hearing all of that, you're getting that feedback, and I found that to be very helpful, especially, just getting audio confirmation in this chaos if you're not sure that, like, the input that you put in is even actually happening. But I gotta say, the music in this game, I feel like it is the number one contributor to the ambience, the feel, and even the world building. I mean, just the sense of journey, the vastness of the environments, the ocean, but also how empty it is. Also playing in on your character's feeling of loneliness, of longing, just not sure where they fit in. And also just in general, giving you the sense of like how small we are in this huge world. It just feels like the music nailed it for me. It certainly nailed it for the underwater feel, but just the inspiration that I feel from the sounds that I'm hearing and the orchestration. Like, obviously you get a vague sense of like Donkey Kong Country aquatic ambience, but then like I'm feeling at times some influences from like Final Fantasy X. Like, there's one song that I swear just sounds so reminiscent of the Macalania Woods, but also like the cheeriness of games like Bug Fables, sometimes being cutesy and silly, like some of the music going on in the shops, but also meaningful, just feeling meaningful. Even when you sit at the bonfires, which are not bonfires, they're moon snail shells, which is awesome. They're very beautiful, but just the meaningful sounds and music that you're feeling. Also, something that happened in the game that I feel like took a lot from Elden Ring is that the song that's on the credits is like the song of the last area. So like when you're getting to that last area, you're like feeling like there's a summit here, like, oh, we're coming full circle. So I just feel like the music being self-aware and being so intertwined with your experience is really important. And I gotta be honest, this is what wound up keeping me coming back, even more than the story, more than the characters. Just the feeling that I had when I was hearing this music, it really had a power over me. It made me want to come back, and ultimately why I bought the vinyl for the game. And then finally, the visuals, really strong colors. So we talked about it being sort of Little Mermaid meets SpongeBob, but it's 3D cartoonish. So it's not like, these flats, outlines and things like that. Like, it is well rendered, rounded features. A lot of it is just solid colors. Like, even your character is just like, anytime you have a crab that's out of a shell or whatever, it's just like kind of this orange pink, salmon color. And it's like their whole body's that color. So you're not getting a ton of detail, but really just strong colors overall. And solid colors, and I feel like it just adds to the vibe of being simple, yet slightly cartoonish. So even just the objects or the trash, the human objects, like we talked about, like combs and whatnot. So I feel like they even picked objects that were just like, this would make sense to just all be like a sky blue or something. So it doesn't overcomplicate things visually. There is some variation in the environment, especially when it comes to the sand versus the water and the tint. So like there are places that seem very clean, others that seem very dirty and polluted, but there's going to be this range of like feeling like you're in Fiji versus if you're in like a polluted mire. It really does track because sometimes like you're able to see a lot further than other times. Indicators are very good, like the idea that things highlight or flash, like finding shells, you can pick them out of the environment from far away. When you're doing your power moves, like it glows a bit, or when an enemy is doing something special, like it's glowing. So having those combat indicators coupled with the sound feedback. There is some frustration with the environment we've talked about, like different platforms or like not sure if this rock is something I can jump on. They tend to be a bit grainier, or the edges of environments tend to be a bit grainier. Maybe that's to help you, but they were still sort of solid colors. So I was always trying to test different things to see if I could use them to get up higher. The map, picturesque like we talked about, but not always helpful. So just, some inconsistencies there that may affect how you play. All right, let's wrap up the conversation about Another Crab's Treasure. I knew coming into this, after writing my notes for this episode, that this was going to be a long one. This journey for me through this game was a long one. I love From Software games. I love Souls-like. I think it's overused at times, especially with a lot of smaller games, 2D games. You know, anytime anybody wants to just say like, oh, our game is really tough, it's a Souls-like, I think it's overused in the zeitgeist or whatever. But I really do think it applies here, and it's obvious that they've tried to emulate that, not just from the gameplay, but from their inspiration. Clearly, they're taking from Software games. The setting drew me in. That's why I bought the game. That's why I was intrigued by it. And it started out very fast and very interesting, and I was very intrigued. But there were multiple moments in this game where, I shit you not, I was ready to put this game down. I was ready to put the controller down and be like, I've had enough of this game. I don't need to finish this. I'm getting really frustrated, whether it was boss fights or just general encounters out in the world. Frustration with the input timing, the sequencing, getting caught in the environment, having to do platforming and fighting at the same time. And, you know, true to Souls-likes, I actually played this game in claw mode even more than I've played a From Software game in claw mode. So having to manage all of those things at the same time, I feel like just got too much in the way. And I don't know if this is a consequence of this being a game who's trying to do it all, because this game has the Souls-like challenge, the cadence, the bonfire progression, cool skill trees that aren't even really in Souls-likes, getting different moves, customizing your character and how you want to play. But it also has the 3D platforming, very reminiscent of A Hat in Time, but also getting Metroidvania traversal things or unlocking, you know, lock and key stuff where you're backtracking, really feeding the completionist, certainly in me. I think that it doesn't nail a lot of these things at the same time, which I think is a tall task to begin with, but it actually turns out that this is a great experience, especially when it comes to open exploration and challenge. In terms of value, I think $30 is solid. Any sale I feel like is going to be good for this game. I got it for $15. I feel like that's a great deal, and I really think I'm basing that on the fact that there is a lot of game here. It has its frustrations, but for me, at the end, I was really glad that I stuck it out and got the Platinum Trophy, and I bought the soundtrack. Like, this was an experience for me where I'm looking back and I'm feeling like I put myself in this world and I really had a good experience, and I'm taking something away from it, despite all of the annoyances and the nitpicking and things that I would certainly change and go back to the drawing board about. But I think this game, especially having the high degree of customization and accessibility, it could really make this for all skill levels and people who would play all kinds of games, not even Souls-like. So for that reason, despite all its flaws, I do recommend this game. All right, that's going to wrap it up for this episode. Stay tuned for our next episode to see what new game we've found for you.